moving on to session number 2. It is the Channel Evolution in Food and Beverage, hosted by Jesse Itzkowitz, right here on the end. This panel will look at the psychology behind impulse purchases and how consumer behavior has been impacted by macro-level factors like inflation and working from home, like we discussed in the last panel. So take it away, Jesse.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire. Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Itzkowitz, and I am Chief Behavioral Scientist here at Ipsos. And I'm so lucky to be joined today with some real experts about impulse. We have Sarah Lehman, we have Kyle Goings, and Sarah Tomasitis, who all are real leaders in helping us understand how consumers are navigating the new normal, especially as it comes to the impulse purchases that we make. So today's really going to be a discussion that we're going to have together, really thinking about some of the psychological underpinnings of impulse and really how that's playing out across the different categories that we're in, both in terms of food delivery with Kyle at Grubhub, as well as in your traditional point of sale stuff and candy with Sarah from Mars. So really, really excited to have all of you here today. Really looking forward to this. So would love to start off with maybe just even a quick poll. And we talked a little bit in the last discussion about how inflation is changing the way that we shop and how we eat. And so you see here a QR code has posted up online. Just take a picture with your phone. It'll bring you to a 1-question survey. Really, and again, we're interested in what you have done. And so we'll be able to see some of these results come up live right now. We've had 2 people respond.
Curious to see how similar or different this is to the poll we saw in the first one.
No, it's fascinating, right? And a lot of us are reporting no change. And so why don't we look at, we did some polling over the past couple of weeks of the US population, and I like that it's still moving. Let's see where the US population landed. Are we? Great. And so it's interesting, right? When we ask people this question, we get a very different response than what's in this room, with about 56, more than half people, saying that they've reduced the amount of food and beverage purchases that they have. And I know, Sarah, you wanted to say something maybe a little bit about what these numbers may or may not mean.
Yeah. Well, first, Jesse and I were chatting about this is all claimed, and there's a part of impulse purchasing that is innately subconscious, so you may not be excited to say, I'm out there making purchases I didn't plan to make, especially with inflation. But the other thing I thought was interesting is that even though more than half of the population say they're making fewer impulse purchases, it's still about 1/3 of the general population making them at least once a week, and then about half of Gen Z. So even if you're making them fewer as a net over time, you're still making them pretty often, and then still maybe more than you think you are.
And it's fascinating, right? One of these classic say-do gaps potentially in market research. And I think this is why the idea of impulse, especially as it relates to food, really calls for behavioral science to help us get an understanding of what's really happening underneath the surface. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, behavioral science is really the exploration of what the hidden and non-conscious factors of our decisions are, and then utilizing these levers in our go-to-market strategy in order to affect attitudinal or behavioral change. And it's truly an interdisciplinary field, and my team draws on a number of different talents, thinking about cognitive psychology, how does something capture our attention at the point of sale to really drive us to buy in that moment? Social psychology, how do I think about myself and my own identity if I am that person who's consistently giving into that impulse, or potentially the person who's really known for resisting that temptation one way or another? Many of you are probably familiar with behavioral economics. These are all the books we're starting to see once again at Hudson News now that we're back in the airports, like Predictably Irrational or Nudge. that are really about how do we shape the choice architecture and the environment to make some decisions more likely than others. And then I think it's sometimes surprising to people, but we also investigate cultural anthropology. At the end of the day, our decisions have meaning, and that meaning is not fully independently driven by ourselves, right? It's by our culture. And so we really need to understand what that is as we think about impulse. And so as we take this behavioral science lens to the conversation today, I always like to ground us with just a basic kind of understanding of what some of the definitions are. And I think that behavioral science has a pretty simple but powerful definition of what impulse is. And behavioral science really classifies this along 3 different dimensions. The first is that there's this degree of spontaneity to it, right? And I think that that spontaneous element might speak a little bit to that say-do gap, right? It's happening in the moment. It's unplanned, as Oscar and Brian were talking about before, whether it's that purchase that we're making or that 3rd or 4th trip to the fridge later on. All of that has this feeling of it's happening within the moment. I think the second part of this is that most of the time, or at least traditionally, impulse has been immediately gratifying to us, right? We feel it, and we feel that reward, whether it's a Three Musketeers bar that I'm eating, or knowing that I'm not going to have to clean up a single dish in the kitchen tonight because I've ordered from Grubhub. But that idea of the reward coming so immediately is really powerful. And I think this third element is also interesting, is that impulse is felt. And we often feel it as a gut feeling that we have of this desire to act in one way or another way. And while I think behavioral science has done a good job of maybe giving us some of these dimensions, maybe where it's done less of a good job is telling us if impulse is good or bad, right? And I think, when we think about impulse, we can easily think about, I've had a failure of willpower, right? I haven't done what I'm supposed to do. And I think that's how many of us might traditionally think about impulse. But on the other side, impulse can be hugely beneficial to us, right? It makes us feel great in the moment when we actually do it. We're kind of lazy as consumers and people, so it takes away that cognitive effort that we need to have in order to plan things out and to justify every decision that we make. And then there are other situations where it might even help us remember something, right? So if I'm going to a party for my 6-year-old daughter's friend, I probably want to buy batteries at the checkout for her toy that I've gotten as well. And so there's kind of these different elements to it. And so I'd love to hear from our panelists today, how are you and your companies thinking about impulse? And is it thought of as a good thing or a bad thing? And Kyle, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I personally don't think it's a bad thing in most cases. I mean, if I look at myself, when I'm running around at the office, now that we're back to office a couple days a week, I'm like, I forgot to order lunch. Like, I need to impulsively order lunch. It's way better to do that than to feel hungry all day. So it kind of depends on the context. Another example that I always look to is, think about at a grocery store. There's all the candy, drinks, chips, snacks at the front. That's exactly what they're getting at. They're trying to show you things that are relevant to you as a consumer at that point in time and make it very easy for you that you might have forgotten that thing when you were doing your shopping, but you want to quiet down your screaming kid with a candy bar or something like that. So it doesn't always have to be a bad thing. Obviously, it's very contextual, but the way that we view it is it's opportunity. Prefer to try to tap into something that the consumer wants. Maybe they just don't know it yet.
And with your Grubhub customers, do you find that a lot of the purchases are impulsive in nature, or are you starting to see more customers plan their deliveries?
We've always had a portion of our deliveries that are pre-planned, where someone says, I want my meal for dinner, and they order it at 10 a.m. So there's always that type of a person. The majority of them are, I want my food right now. They order it for as soon as possible. One interesting thing that we see on the part of the business that I focus most on the new verticals growth side, so think convenience, alcohol, grocery, et cetera, is the concept of an add-on. So this goes back to the example I just gave at the grocery store. You've already done your shopping, or you've already placed your food order. We want you to also order from a 7-Eleven, for example. So as you get later in the checkout or even after the checkout, we'll show them an option to say, do you want to add on anything from this other convenience store now that you've already placed that initial order at the restaurant? So we've seen a lot more of that happening, where people are thinking about things kind of more holistically as opposed to just this food order.
That's really interesting. Sarah, what about you? How is Mars thinking about impulse? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Do you define it any differently?
Yeah, I mean, we don't call it good or bad. If you talk to consumers in the moment, when they're sort of trying our treats or snacks or gum, they love it, right? They're happy that they have a need, it's been satisfied. So in the moment, consumers will tell us they're happy, right? We've trained consumers over many years to buy our types of products at the front end of the store, so they don't have to go into aisles. They don't have to remember to buy our products or put it on a list. They just see it. They're at the end of the grocery shopping experience. They're sort of depleted. They got through. They want to reward themselves. So it's a great opportunity to sort of lift people up while they're at the end of the shop. In the digital experience, it's a little bit different because we've trained our consumers not to put our products on the list. And when we talk to consumers and ask them, well, when would you want to buy us in a shop? Similar to what Kyle shared, it's at the end. That's when they're used to sort of treating themselves. They're at the end of the shop. They got through the food order, figuring out what all of the family wants to order. This is not personal at all. Finally done it. And then at the end, yeah, we'll treat ourselves to something from a convenience store, add a little booze to it or something like that. Just, reward ourselves for a shop well done.
That's such an interesting point, right? That we've trained our shoppers to not put us on the list. And it, I think, brings up a point that we're clearly all thinking about, which is the evolution of this channel of food, right? And Sarah, you hit on it well, especially as we've moved to the online space. And when we think about impulse, one of the things that we know from psychology is just how contextual it is, right? It happens in the moment, in a place, at a time, with some people, without other people. And this is something in psychology that we call stimulus-based decision making, right? It's sort of how that environment is truly shaping the decisions that you're making. And so I know that we have some data on how people may or may not be shopping impulsively across these different channels. Sarah, I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, a couple things that came to mind, but one is that most of the impulse decisions are made where you would typically find the product, and it sounds like you're kind of in agreement on that, that if it's at the end in a physical store space, then I also want it at the end in a digital. So how do you capitalize on where people would typically have the moment naturally, whether they're in-store, online, or a hybrid of both? And then this idea of the binary impulse, good or bad. I think we see that the drivers of why you're making impulse purchases are either I wanted to treat myself or the price was too good to pass up. So, and I think we can all relate to that the price is right and it makes me feel good. But knowing that it maybe is a bit blended, that the price isn't so high that it starts to deplete from the pleasure I get from it. Or that the pleasure is so high that it justifies a higher price point. So, and that was reflected in the kind of pre-research we did for this session.
So that's amazing. And so do those two kind of drivers of impulse seem to be relevant for your category? I mean, certainly you mentioned reward. What about opportunity with price? Are you starting to see any of that as well?
I mean, from a price perspective, I think that obviously it's really critical right now. So we see consumers can sort of trade up and down throughout our categories, sort of making decisions. So they maybe they're used to buying a pack of fun-sized Snickers, and they can sort of trade down and buy a bar instead. So we try to offer opportunities, different opportunities for consumers to sort of purchase within pricing ranges that work for them. So I'm sure that there's a lot of switching going on right now for consumers as they're looking at their pocketbooks, deciding what they can afford and what, they still want the chocolate, they still want that mood boost and that joy, but they're just trying to sort of evaluate at what price they're willing to pay.
Yeah, I think we see similar things in that example that I was bringing up a minute ago on the, do you want to add this onto your order? Because someone may be priced out of ordering a second time and paying another delivery fee and another tip. But if we can provide that add-on experience, and we know that there's someone starting here, or the driver can pick up at this 7-Eleven or convenience store on the way to the restaurant while they're preparing the food, it doesn't really take that much more time if we do a good job routing that driver in the right way. So it actually brings the effective price down and makes it more accessible to more of our customers by bundling it together like that. So we take advantage of the natural food prep times to make it easier for people to place that second order to get that chocolate and get the mood boost.
No, and it's fascinating to think, right? And both of those can occur both in the physical as well as the online space. And I'm wondering, whether or not that's true for all customers. Do we find that all sorts of consumers are shopping impulsively the same at the store or online, or is there a difference based on the type of shopper, Sarah?
We definitely see a difference, and I think it's a bit intuitive that Gen Z is more likely to shop online and more likely to make impulse purchases online. Everybody's kind of making them in store, but Jesse and I were chatting about the Gen Z's been kind of raised and trained in this online environment and are maybe more sensitive to the emotional cues online and maybe less sensitive to the cues in store. And then seeing it kind of march that way as the generations become older, and then heavy for the in-store impulse, like a heavy drop-off when you go past millennials. So definitely a difference in behavior as the generations emerge.
It's fascinating, right? And in much of the same way we've trained our generation of shoppers to maybe do so in the store, there may be those triggers and rewards for this new generation in the online space that potentially we might not even fully discovered what those are yet. And so certainly as we've thought a little bit more about online, I'm curious to the adaptations that you might have taken at Mars, and then of course Grubhub being entirely online, how are you addressing that in your markets? Sarah?
Yeah, so back to the point of training consumers not to sort of search for us. We've been at the lovely front end of the store checkout. We're not really on the list often. We've been working a lot on our consumer journeys. We're not a high involvement category like a TV or a toaster where you'd research a lot and try to decide what you want. It's really usually what do I want right now? What do I have a taste for? So we're working a lot to try to understand where consumers are on a broader journey. If they're looking for work and study hacks, trying to focus more. Well, here's some gum while you're on that journey. Looking for hacks, looking at influencers. If you're looking for a health and well-being, and you're trying to understand how to not have a morning slump, we've got Nature's Bakery and Kind, right? So we've got lots of products that we can sort of prime consumers based on the time of day, where they are, what they're doing, what they're searching for, to make sure that we're sort of contextually relevant and in those spaces where their consumers are more primed to think about us and be open to us.
I love that, and I definitely want to come back to those because I think that there's so much rich discussion that we can have about the evolution of the touch point, right? And how that might have changed, not only in terms of where they are, but when they are and who they are and how they feel about themselves too. I'm curious, how deep in the journey do you have to start, right? Knowing that impulsiveness is an in-the-moment thing that we might have less control over, does this mean that Mars is starting its story earlier or the brand building comes more important?
Yeah, yes and yes. So I think we're trying to sort of latch on to spaces where we know consumers are sort of open to our products, knowing that they're not searching for Snickers and Twix online, trying to research us. So we're really trying to sort of understand more deeply, what sort of moments and occasions are they consuming us? When are they more open to choosing a Kind bar over some extra gum versus a Twix, right? So understanding those spaces, but then taking a step back and not thinking with the category or the brand lens and just thinking, how can we meet consumers where they are in the journey and really sort of offer some options for them to choose in this sort of omni-channel environment.
I love that. What about you, Kyle? It's obviously a different market that you're in,
yeah.
So clearly you must be approaching it from a totally different angle.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, obviously we're an online-only company, but our goal is to bring more people to the food online concept. We had a nice tailwind, which was a bad thing for the world, but the COVID pandemic pulled ahead a lot of that demand. People that maybe haven't tried it yet, that we're going to order in a year or two, all of a sudden they're ordering now. So we actually brought a lot more people into this world of getting their food or non-food items delivered via the internet, basically. So it was a really interesting shift for us where we had to think about there's a lot of people out there that we need to market to outside of core cities where, like in New York, and there's a lot of people from New York here, where food delivery's been around for at least 10, 15, 20 years. And we had to kind of think about how do we market to these customers that are new to the industry, that might not live in a city where they're used to getting food at any restaurant, any hour of the day. So we had to really kind of rethink, like, how should we be approaching these new to industry customers? So it's been an interesting journey to try to bring more people into the online world, even though that is what our business is. So we have to think about outside of it as well.
And it's fascinating, right? Because although we certainly have a lot of choices once we're on the platform, once we pick up the phone, we also have choices in terms of which delivery app we might use. And so how are you addressing kind of the impulsivity of that decision that consumers are making?
Yeah, I mean, as an e-commerce company, I mean, we're always trying to stay top of mind. I mean, I'm sure everyone here gets push notifications, they get emails, they get all these different touch points to try to stay top of mind, and we're trying to always provide the relevant content to the right person at the right time. Because if I'm sending you ice cream at 6 in the morning, it's probably not going to be that relevant. That's something that we try to target based on what we know about that customer. Have they ordered it before? Did they typically do that later at night, which is a trend that we see, unsurprisingly. So we're really trying to approach things just from like a personalization standpoint to try to just make sure that we're showing people the right thing at the right time.
I love that, right? And there's certainly one truism in psychology, which is that there's nothing that we love more than ourselves, right? And so that feeling of personalization certainly carries through to the mental availability that people have for Grubhub.
I would say also,
yeah, please.
Has learned that I've got 2 toddlers and eat dinner real early. So you guys have learned that to start delivering my reminders a lot earlier than probably the average person eats. So nice job there.
Yeah, you also know the nights my wife is working, and I get a lot of targeted pizza messages on those evenings for me. But it's absolutely interesting, and I think it relates to what you were talking about as well, Sarah, about finding those micro moments where you have that opportunity to persuade. So we've certainly thought about maybe some of the adaptations that we've made to operating in this online environment. And not my quote, Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler says, if you want somebody to do something, just make it easy. Remove the barriers, right? It's a relatively simple thing to do in theory. In practice, it's a lot harder. And I'm curious to, what are the barriers that you're seeing? What are the barriers that you've potentially overcome? And what are the barriers that really seem like challenges that you're not sure how to solve yet? Either one, yeah.
You or me?
Yeah, so I mean, for gum, one of the things that we've been thinking about throughout the pandemic is gum is for freshening, right? And for people that are out and about and socializing. So that's been a little problematic when people were not socializing nearly as much. So we've really been thinking a lot about it in terms of like how we meet consumers where they are. They're shifting, they're changing, we need to do the same. So for gum specifically, we've started talking about like other needs that people have outside of fresh breath confidence. Anxiety for one. So a lot of gum chewers tell us that they chew gum to sort of relieve stress. And now are like the most stressful times ever. So like we've really been trying to deeply understand people, where they are, what the trends are, and try to make sure that we're meeting them where they are rather than just delivering the same message over and over that might not be as relevant for them today.
I love that. And it's so interesting, especially within your category, because we typically think about maybe a barrier to purchase as the impulse barrier, but in some cases, especially with gum, it might be the barrier to consumption. And if we think about some of the innovations that we've seen within your category, taking things out of the wrapper and putting them into a cup, right, or a bag where I don't have that barrier of either unwrapping or maybe even the barrier of guilt of seeing the 20 Twix wrappers on my table at the end of the evening. And so it's interesting to kind of think about there are those purchase barriers, but then there's also the consumption barriers as well. And potentially we really need to address both of them simultaneously.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like, people need to like desire and want to purchase, right? So we need to make sure that there's the desire first, so that they can go out and actually make that purchase.
I love that. Kyle, what about you? What sort of barriers are you seeing with regard to impulse?
Yeah, so like I said, most of my team is focusing on the adoption of non-restaurant orders and trying to drive the growth there, because one thing I'll touch on real quick is we actually see when people order more from these types of new businesses that we call them, or non-restaurant verticals, they actually end up ordering more from restaurants, which was a really surprising and unintuitive trend at first, but it actually made sense after we thought about it for a few hours, because most of our orders are from restaurants, so if we have better customer retention, we just naturally will get more orders from that person, whether it's restaurants or these ones that we're actually getting them to order from. And the challenge that I think that we're having, or that we did have, was trying to inform everyone that we're not just a restaurant company. I mean, look at our name, Grub Hub. It's what we've always been, was restaurant focused. So we need to get people thinking, I can get more than just food. I can get snacks, or restaurant food, I guess. I can get snacks, I can get drinks, I can get alcohol. So it's been a kind of a pivot for us to try to figure out how's the best way to do that. How can we inform people? And it's all about, like I said earlier, being relevant. We don't want to show these types of things to someone that just doesn't care about it. We want to find the right people to show the right thing to. So it's just been a balance of blasting out to everyone versus trying to keep it relevant while trying to maximize the impact of, we have more than just restaurants now.
Yeah, and it's an interesting way, again, to solve that maybe impulse at the phone as well, right? If you have that higher mental availability of, I think of Grubhub when I think food, regardless of what that food is, it means that you'll kind of capture a large amount of those orders later on. So both of you were already hitting on this, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. It's just this discussion of what these new cues or triggers might be towards impulse, right? And I think you've already talked about a couple of them, right? So maybe we're losing a little bit of the physicality, maybe not. And I'm curious to kind of how you're using some of the new technologies that are available to help identify what those moments of disruption are, where you can fit your message in and kind of meet the customer at their moment of impulse. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, we've done lots of research in the space trying to understand sort of shopping moments, where people are on their shopping journey, consumption moments, and then just overall where people are in general. So really trying to make sure that we're hitting them with the right messaging at the right time, cueing consumption moments to remind them, or even just helping them to understand, like, yeah, you should be working right now. It seems like you're online just goofing around. Like, Gone helps to focus, right? Like, how do we like make sure that we've got the messages at the right time in the right place, both sort of from a digital perspective, but then also from the physical perspective. I like that Oscar shared that people are still going into stores, right? They might be doing the click and collect, but then like our products like are inherently like, what do I have a taste for right now, right? And like often like you don't know until you're in that moment. So people will do their click and collect with the basics that are super easy, but then go into the store to sort of pick the stuff that they're craving and they want right now in the next hour or so. And you really don't know until you're really in that moment often.
I love it, right? So let's buy all those ads on Wordle when I'm using it at work instead of answering emails. Kyle, what about you? And I think, Sarah, you brought this up, right? You're knowing your customers really, really well. And you lead a team of advanced analytics within the company to really help understand what these customers are doing, when they're doing it, how they're doing it. So I'm curious, are there overall things that you've identified as maybe newer triggers or unexpected triggers to consumption that maybe people hadn't thought about before?
Yeah, I don't know if these are necessarily new or surprising. They kind of almost validated the hypotheses that we had, but it was still good to validate that. But we found that we've done an extensive customer segmentation on who are these people that are ordering from Grubhub. What are they ordering? When are they ordering it? Where in the country do they live? Are they in urban downtown areas? Are they in suburbs, or are they rural? We've done all these different cuts to try to understand who's ordering what, why, and when. And we found a lot of similarities that they make intuitive sense. I don't think I would have guessed it at the time, though. Like, for example, someone that is most likely to order from a convenience store is someone who's also a heavy purchaser of chain restaurants like McDonald's. there's some similarities like that where we can help build these segments of customers to understand who should we be showing what. And there's also geographic trends, like I said. People that live in downtown urban areas tend to be much more impulsive, I'll say, by getting the convenience type orders. And there's probably more kind of what Sarah was talking about the differences in kind of the driver or the reason. So it's like I might be really busy at work and I'm stuck on the train and I can't get home because the train is stuck, so I'm gonna order food and that's how I justify it. So there's a lot of things like that in the urban environment where it's just kind of like the hustle and bustle of the downtown where you just can easily justify it, at least for myself I can.
And it's interesting, right? Because part of it is that opportunity that's present. And then, Sarah, as you were saying before, part of it's the price of it too, right? And to be able to take advantage of something. And I know both of your companies continually experiment with bundles, just as we were talking about beforehand. And I'm curious how you've seen bundling play into Impulse, either positively or negatively, for your business. Kyle?
Yeah. This goes back to that example that I mentioned earlier about getting the convenience order with your food, with your restaurant food. We do that. We see people that add things on to, this is another McDonald's reference, but do you want fries with that? Like the upsell of the item to increase the basket size, which results in more revenue for the restaurant partner, more tips for the driver. It's a good thing for everyone. So we're always trying to find ways to optimize our business like that, which is, like I said, it's a mutually beneficial thing to do.
Right, and maybe not easier within the digital space, potentially harder within a more physical space. Curious, are there certain types of bundles that you seem to see drive Impulse more than others? What does gum go with?
Yeah, we've tried a lot with gum. Often, like it's with like the coffee, fresh breath, like trying to make sure you're buying something garlicky, like remember to get your gum too, right, for fresh breath. Also for like back to school, like displays, making sure if people are primed for a specific moment, like going back to school, you need the gum for like connections and freshening, but then also again focus, relaxation, all that good stuff. So like we think about bundling often with other products, not necessarily like within the Mars range, because we don't want to encourage like a lot of overconsumption. But our products often aren't sort of trip drivers, they're basket builders. So we want, if somebody's going for their Grubhub order, we'd like them to consider us too. Or if they're going for their grocery shop, add it on to the shop. So our categories are sort of inherently bundled, but we often don't try to bundle a ton within the Mars portfolio.
It's so interesting to think about. In behavioral science, we talk a lot about goal alignment, right? And whether or not it's knowing that I need to do something within the moment, or even understanding what my goals might be when I purchase one of those other products. It seems like those goal-relevant items, whether it's a balancer or a magnifier, really seem to be really effective here. So one last question, I guess, before we end. We know a lot about Impulse, given that it drives so much of our business. Curious to what your wish lists are. What do you wish you knew from a research perspective that you think would help you unlock Impulse a little bit better in the evolution of retail? Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, right now what we're doing a lot of is just trying to leverage our sort of foresight chops to understand like what is the consumer of the future, if they're staying at home more, using like voice, right? Like for shopping, like, as digital shopping sort of continues to increase, we want to make sure that we're prepared to understand like how we sort of like meet the consumer in their smart home where they are. So as more people are working from home, staying at home, like what's the Impulse at home look like, and how do we make sure that we're sort of staying relevant for our consumers?
I love that.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really like, it's kind of what was just said, but what will be the next thing? I think if you would have asked people 30 years ago, do you want food delivered to you? Everyone would have said no. But look at it today. Like, where are we at right now where looking back in 10, 20 years that we would all say no to today? I want to know like what's that next thing that's like the next frontier. And I think the challenge with that is if you ask people, they might say no now, but that doesn't mean no. It just means I haven't found the need or thought about that yet, but we need to have it, and then people will be open to it. So I think there's a lot of testing that we could do as a company to do that, which we are always doing, but you never know what's later down the road. So.
I love that. It's so interesting. So people always ask me, right, as a scientist, well, what do I do to actually drive the impulse, right, in this new environment? And we've really seen kind of three things, and I think we've actually touched upon a couple of them today. This first idea is of balancing, right, knowing that there are good and bad aspects. How do we blend those together within our experience? I think the second is something that you were getting at as well, which is how do we bring the consumer closer to that moment of impulse through maybe simulation, and not just the metaverse, but maybe even higher quality images or even the sound of that wrapper being unlocked. And then finally, how do we make sure that those are immediate, right? And I think that'll be continually a challenge, but as we see food delivery get quicker, maybe that'll be a solve for all of us. So thank you so much. This has been super insightful. Really appreciate it.